Considering how fast wages are rising these days, many CFOs would love to be able to predict the future of pay. Unlike other inputs, salaries and wages seem hard to track and even more difficult to forecast. That got one man thinking. Meet Cary Sparrow, a former U.S. naval officer and founder and CEO of greenwich.hr, where he helps HR professionals and consulting firms predict the future of pay. He's leveraged 35 plus years of combined engineering, military, consulting, and operations leadership to help companies achieve organizational growth. Today on A Seat at the Table, Cary will be discussing how to predict what pay will look like in the future, why predicting pay trends can help companies stay ahead of competitors, and how real-time pay trends help make the labor market more transparent. Like all costs, pay trends are cyclical, but finding top talent is always a challenge in any market cycle. That's why leading organizations turn to AsiaNet consultants to help them recruit the right people, the kind of leadership and team members who can help form that all-important backbone that ensures companies' success. To learn more about AsiaNet Consultants, visit their website at asianetconsultants.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Meanwhile, let's find out from Cary how we can predict the future of pay. Well, Cary, thank you so much for joining us here today on A Seat at the Table. I am just delighted that you're able to be here. I think that for anybody listening to this, what you talk about, the future of pay, is on everybody's mind because right now costs have been very, very hard to predict. Well, everything's been hard to predict. So pay is obviously a big one. I mean, for a lot of companies, payroll is, if not the biggest expense, one of the biggest expenses. And at the same time, people are always trying to figure out what should I be paying people in order to attract the right talent. So I think it's really interesting that you're able to tackle that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Jane. I appreciate it. And yeah, I founded our business about 7 years ago with the idea that the market for pay, the market for jobs could be a lot more transparent than it has been. And that's based on kind of my own history working with companies, over the last, at the time, it was about 25 years, looking at questions around talent and how to be competitive with talent and true talent. And really the ability to understand what's happening with how people are getting paid has historically been very limited, but with the labor market, the way that it's been since the pandemic, it's been more dynamic than it's been in any of our careers, really. And so you'd have to go back to the late 70s and the early 80s to see some of the market factors. And I would argue that it's even more dynamic now than it was back in those times 45 years ago. And you've got things like inflation, wage inflation, remote work. For the better part of 3 years, we had a lot of work restrictions that folks were dealing with. We had a lot of people that were shifting careers, and as a result, their entire approach to what they valued in jobs had changed pretty fundamentally. All these different factors were going on at exactly the same time, and many of them still are today. And as a result, you were starting to see things very quickly, like in 2021 through 2022, the pay rates for new employees across all jobs in the U.S. were going up at over 20% a year. Okay,
wow.
So this is, to put it in perspective, historically, wages had gone up 2 to 4% a year. And now we're seeing companies having to really struggle to find talent and really increasing pay rates at the same time that there were lots of other movements going on to, for example, increase the minimum wage. And so you're seeing unprecedented wage inflation, which created all kinds of havoc for companies. At the same time, remote work was fundamentally changing the way that companies were looking at where they could source talent from and how they needed to manage teams. And for job seekers, remote work also meant that an entire new market, a new universe of possibilities in terms of career options were opening up for them. So all these things were going on at the same time. And it was really interesting because most of what you were hearing in the market over the last two years or so around pay was largely based on anecdotes. It was largely based on pain points that were very pronounced, but government data was late and it wasn't very granular. Historical information like salary survey information and so forth was very late and it was very backwards looking. And we were sitting on top of data that was showing what was going on in real time, for pretty much any job in any market. And the story was much more complicated than what people were seeing. And it really opened the door for a recognition that there's a fundamentally different way to see what's going on in the market and a fundamentally different way to develop strategies around pay and hiring and retention of talent than what people had been used to before. And we've, as a result, in our businesses and others like them that provide real-time labor market intelligence, we've seen a huge increase in demand and a huge increase in funding for new ventures.
I think that's really interesting. Now, how do you predict what pay will be like in the future?
Well, so most sources of information about what jobs are getting paid now are based on salary surveys that are administered by a variety of different firms, industry associations, compensation consultants, and so forth, that take data from companies about their existing employees and ask them and anonymize them to say how much for a given job are you paying them, and then they aggregate that, and that's the view of the market. We take a fundamentally different approach, which is to look at what companies are saying they will pay for jobs that they're in the process of hiring. And so, and we do that at a really large scale. We track about 80% of all the new jobs being created in the U.S. So an enormous, statisticians kind of salivate over a sample size of that magnitude. And as a result, we're able to see a very clear picture on what companies will be paying. Now, when we say we're predicting, our predictions are good for 3 to 6 months out, forward looking, because that's how long it takes to process a lot of jobs through hiring. Lower paid jobs can process much faster, obviously, but it's a very forward looking view as opposed to a backwards looking view, and as a result, it's much more sensitive to changes in market conditions.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. How are you able to get that data then from, as you're saying, you're able to get that data on what companies say they would be willing to pay?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we do is we have technology that we developed. We launched our technology platform back in 2016. So we've been tracking this data now for going on 8 years. And so 8 years. And the way that we do it is we look at online job listings and we extract a huge amount of intelligence from those. We look at company sites, we look at big job boards, and pull data from those. And in some cases, we contract directly with those sites to pull their data in. And then we go through the process of sorting out any duplications, getting everything put into kind of a common framework so that our clients can analyze it and do it in a very, powerful and efficient way. So that's where it comes from. And our technology is running, 24/7. So we update our view of the labor market every single day completely.
Wow. I mean, that's massive when you're talking about a data set that big, and to be able to update it daily is quite an undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah. At any given time and I'll just speak to the US for the moment, but we track data from about 60 different countries.
Really?
In the US at any given moment, there's over 10 million job openings. And so we go out and look at literally about 8 million web pages every day.
I guess that leads to, the question that begs to be answered is, where do you see the biggest growth in pay? I mean, in job categories and locations, what are you seeing in that data?
So one of the things that's really interesting is that the story about pay at the national level is not the story about pay in any given market. And the story about pay in a given market for all jobs is not the story about pay for a specific job. So, for example, nationally, for 18 months ending in the end of 2022, pay rates across all jobs across the U.S. had gone up over 30%, advertised pay rates. But if you looked at where those were going up the most nationally, it was very much in the clinical space in healthcare. No question about it. Healthcare was seeing the biggest demand and the biggest increases. But those were, those rates varied tremendously based on which metro you were looking at. And there were many jobs outside of healthcare that went up at much faster rates. Early in the pandemic, the area of biggest growth were the lower paying jobs.
Right.
So jobs that are paying closer to minimum wage. This is a big jump, but all jobs were seeing increases in pay. So Healthcare really jumped up, I would say, clinical within healthcare, clinical professions, nurses, nurse medical assistants, and phlebotomists, and so forth. We're seeing big increases in pay, but it really was pretty universal. And the story really varied depending on which market you were in and which job you looked at. One of the things that's been interesting is marrying up the conversation about pay and hiring, because obviously you track hiring too, with the narrative that's going on about what's happening in the economy. And if you kind of replay the tapes from even a year and a half ago, there's been a lot of kind of hand wringing about impending recessions, that it was really obvious that the labor market just did not hear, it was not getting the memo about an impending recession. And because hiring rates and even pay rates were continuing to climb while people were talking about impending layoffs and so forth. And it just kind of illustrated how we're built on kind of an information sharing economy that is largely based on anecdotes, and there's not a ton of reliable intelligence that is underlying those narratives. Even when more tech companies started laying off workers and then those layoffs started spreading, it was really interesting because we were still seeing pay for IT workers in particular continuing on, demand for IT workers going up. So a lot of the layoffs were not happening necessarily with folks that were doing coding, with developers and so forth. They were in sales and recruiting and other types of functions. So the narrative is a bit, I think, jumbled.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's unfortunate, but you're right. It really ends up being a couple of clickbait headlines, and then the media becomes somewhat of an echo chamber. One person
Right.
says it, everybody else repeats it, because you're absolutely correct on that. It is amazing that during the pandemic, everyone panicked about losing their job. And yet, as you said, in fact, salaries went up. And granted, some of that is because there was a huge demand, like you said, for healthcare, which is a labor-intensive kind of a business, and frontline workers, right? All the delivery for e-commerce and the warehouse workers. So yes, those are sectors that employ a lot of headcount. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, you didn't hear about too many people being laid off. So yet people were talking about that.
Yeah. There were lots of stories about businesses that were going under, but at the same time, there were other businesses that were really thriving, and entirely new parts of the economy emerged almost overnight. Supply chain was another one that early on demand went through the roof, and pay went up, especially at the entry levels, pretty substantially. It's still high today. So I guess all that points to kind of the fact that whatever's in the headlines is really not actionable intelligence. It leads to kind of a national psyche and kind of a national perception of what's going on. But if you're a manager trying to find talent, or if you're a manager facing, like, there's lots of companies that have large portions of the workforce that are very pay sensitive, and somebody down the street that is willing to pay 50 cents an hour more, or $1 an hour more, could find themselves in a very precarious position in terms of keeping their talent. And if you're a manager in those positions, then traditional sources of intelligence about what's happening is not really serving you well in terms of coming up with approaches that you need in order to run your business and really thrive. And if you're a job seeker, you really you have to do a lot of legwork yourself in terms of finding out where the opportunities are and how to maximize kind of the next step in your career. Because again, the headlines would point to one set of narratives, whereas the reality is a different set of narratives. Like I personally don't feel like if you're in a tech role that you have a huge amount that you need to worry about from a career outlook standpoint. But if you're a recruiter right now, then you do have more to worry about, because companies are taking a more cautious approach right now. There's no question that since the beginning of 2023, companies just pulled back on hiring, and we're seeing pay not so much, right? Pay sustained at historically high rates, but hiring is slacked off. And the earliest kind of leading indicator on that is what the hiring rate for recruiters is doing. And that's fallen off just in the last 12 months nationwide. The hiring rate for recruiters has dropped by 60%. So, it's clearly companies are taking a more conservative approach.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business Who hasn't had their tunnel of year? This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yes, I think that's very true. People are very conservative in every aspect of their business, more so than we've seen probably in, I would say, at least 2 decades. On the other hand, I think people, like you say, part of that being, more conservative is also being more strategic in terms of wanting to hire better people and perhaps thinking through who they need. And as you pointed out with tech, yes, there's been a lot of layoffs around tech for sure, but there's many, many different jobs within tech. So people just sort of group tech up, right, as one thing.
Yeah.
But it's really just a certain subset, right, within Silicon Valley and perhaps within the banking sector that have been laid off. Not everybody in every aspect of technology. So, your point about, sort of the narrative that gets kicked about as not being very accurate is really is driven home by that.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say it's a little misleading, but more than that, it's not actionable, right? So it doesn't
Right.
do you really much good in terms of deciding what you need to do either with your own career or with your business or your teams, right? So you're right. It's interesting also, you bring up kind of tech and financial services, and there's no question that, as of kind of the third quarter of 2022, those were the ones where we were seeing things start to pull back. That has spread a bit, I would say, more broadly across most sectors now. We are seeing a more conservative approach to hiring. And like I said, not so much pay. Pay is still, people are paying what they need to in order to compete for talent. And there's still significant talent shortages across lots of different markets. But in conservatism, it's interesting. In some cases, it's conservatism. In other cases, it's strategic opportunity. A lot of companies, I think, are recognizing an opportunity to rationalize kind of their not just their headcounts, but their skills. So
Right.
where skills are deployed, they're rationalizing office space. So a lot of leases are coming up, and if you're running multiple facilities and you're at 50% occupancy, folks are consolidating that down, regardless of their approach around hybrid work and so forth. But yeah, there's opportunities and I would say, a greater degree of conservatism now than even 6 to 9 months ago.
I think you're right about that. And I think that certainly a lot of companies just scaled up massively. When things are going, people don't think it ever is going to end. So typically they get to a certain point where they've overhired, right? And then,
Right.
the pendulum goes back in the other direction. But now we've seen with remote work, right, and people's ability to, communicate over Zoom or without having to be there physically. Are you seeing that companies are now looking at that and wondering, do we need to have people in our same geographic area? I mean, do you see people taking advantage of that to perhaps hire people in lower cost, not necessarily offshore, but within, let's say, the US is a huge country, so obviously pay will vary dramatically from one area to the next in certain jobs. Do you see people taking advantage of that or not really?
Yeah, over the last 2.5 years, there's really been very, very rapid changes in companies' approaches to that, and some swings also. So initially, with lockdowns, the more resilient companies very quickly started sourcing talent from markets other than their own markets. It was very obvious, and then the more pain that companies were experiencing, the broader that approach became, and by the middle of 2022, by the second quarter of 2022, about 2/3 of all jobs, including like grocery workers and, warehouse workers, and, so you lump all those jobs together, 2/3 of them were being advertised as being able to be remote, right? So that's not saying the warehouse workers were remote. That's just saying that, anyone that didn't physically have to be someplace, folks had kind of habituated and recognized that we can staff this, anywhere. That has changed. Right. So as more companies are recognizing that there is something that was lost, through just the total remote work approach, they're now adopting more of a hybrid approach. Hybrid still means you've got to be in the local market, or you've got to find a way to be present there. Right. And so now the pendulum is split. So then out of 2/3 of jobs being advertised as remote, only 1/3 or 1/3 of all jobs right now are advertised as remote, which is still way higher than what it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it was like less than 5%. Only a few percent of jobs. So still much higher. So there's still a lot of sorting out that's going on in terms of this. And one of the drivers was the availability of talent. One of the drivers was pay arbitrage, so the ability to take advantage of lower cost of living areas that maybe had a surplus of talents, and companies scrambled to figure out what those places were. But then that had the consequence of then companies saying, well, should we pay somebody as much as we're paying a Silicon Valley engineer or a New York financial manager the same amount if they're, in South Dakota, or if they're in Mississippi, or if they're in Nashville, Tennessee, and so none of that is sorted out yet, I would say. It's still kind of a work in progress, and the underlying driver in terms of how companies want to staff their organizations and marry kind of the social capital that's essential to, really creating innovation and the empowerment that comes with being able to work flexibly and remotely, companies are still sorting that out, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think, for all the different people I speak with across a very broad spectrum, you really do see a very wide range of opinions on work remotely, work in the office, whether you need to have everybody in the same geographic area, whether you can actually, like you said, take advantage of hiring talent that's not located within striking distance of where your head office is. So you're right. I think people really are trying to find their way through that. We're facing a situation where pay is rising very rapidly. And at the same time, it's hard to find people to fill certain positions. And now AI is it hasn't burst onto the scene, it's burst onto the media because.
So the more information that's available, the more that AI models can really pull out the things that are not necessarily visible, what we've historically called intangibles that were, based on intuition, built on years of experience and years of kind of personal interactions, because we have that kind of intelligence too, as people. The AI models with more data and more technical power can start to pull some of those out as well. And one of the trends that my company takes advantage of is that more and more information is available online, much richer information. So not only can we collect a broader set of information within what we're capturing, it's much richer. And if you look at what's available online about people now, about individuals, there is an enormous amount of information that is available online about every one of us. I mean, almost every one of us has some kind of online footprint. And what that implies is that the AI models that are designed to assess things that are more intangible, whether it's in recruiting or if it's in consumer preferences, and like readiness to buy, there were a number of other things. There's a much richer data set to build those models on, and it'll continue getting richer. So I think we're going to see more power. I think we're going to see more innovation. I don't know whether it's going to be the silver bullet people want it to be, but there's no question that AI will continue to play an increasing role in the way that things get done.
You talk about how real-time pay trends can help make the labor market more transparent. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so we talked about it a little at the beginning, that keep in mind where we're starting from. The state of information a few years ago, and I would say even today for most people, is just so bad if you compare it to anything else. Like in the financial markets, if you want to know what a stock price is, you have instantaneous information about that, and the stock price reflects, instantly almost, the collective understanding of an outlook of a company, right? So because there's so many different information sources. If you want to know what the financial, the state of the financial sector is, if you want to know what the money supply is looking like, all those things are nearly instantaneous. If you want to know, if you wanted to use traditional sources to understand what's going on with pay rates, which skills are being valued, which jobs are being valued, which, locations are seeing more wage pressure. And then you want to expand that to say what's going on with like the supply of talent versus the demand of talent. You basically have been flying blind. The information sources are so bad. The ability to understand pay would typically have easily a plus or minus 20% range on it for any given job. It would not be specific to the location that you're in. It would not be specific to the industry that you're looking at. And to the extent that you were able to find that kind of information, it would be based on really small sample sets. So it's not really that reliable. And so as a result, the ability to really understand what's going on in the labor market has been really very foggy. So real-time information about what's going on with hiring and pay allows you to see exactly what's going on in the labor market. It allows you to see where there are surpluses and gaps in talent availability. It allows you to see which companies are doing better, are more resilient to shocks. Like as an example, right after the pandemic, we helped one of our clients do an analysis where 3 months in, we analyzed what the hiring and pay patterns were for companies across several different sectors. So literally about 100 companies, and very easily identified which companies were resilient to the impact of lockdowns and which ones were not. There were some that were down for the count, that had just stopped all activity. There were others that had gone into bare maintenance mode, and there were a few that within 3 months were hiring faster than they were before lockdowns were happening, and they were seeing their pay rates go up as well. So that kind of, more real-time information provides a transparency that's never been available before. It's never been available before. Another thing that's interesting about transparency is historically, you've never been able to figure out what your competitors are doing. You would encounter, anyone would encounter significant antitrust pushback if they wanted to know what, their competitor down the street was actually paying their employees for specific jobs. They would have to go through a lot of blinded processes and survey processes to get that. The kind of approaches though that are available now that that my own company takes advantage of, we use information that's in the public domain already. And as a result, companies have provided it freely and with no strings. So there are no limitations in terms of your ability to see, if you're working for one company and you want to see what the advertised pay rates are for, the 100 other companies in within 50 miles of you that are the same kind of worker, there's no restrictions on that now if you use data that's sourced in the right way. And so that real time, the ability to collect a real time view of what's happening in the labor market is also creating a level of transparency that's never been available before from a competitive standpoint.
Wow. I mean, that's really a game changer. So perhaps could you tell us a little bit about what you do at WageScape?
Sure. So we're a labor market intelligence platform. We collect intelligence real time. And as I mentioned, every day we're updating our data set. We collect intelligence about demand for talent, and that includes, hiring rates for jobs and skills and pay rates for jobs and skills. Who's hiring? What are they expecting to pay for them? Which, what's the configuration of the jobs and the skills that are required and so forth. And also what we call supply information. So what's the situation of the talent that's in the labor market today? And so we're able to take advantage of online career profiles, for example, to look at what talent exists in the market and how does that talent match up with demand. And so we do that, and then we make that information available to companies across a wide range. We started off as a platform that only provided data to other companies that built applications and services using our data. So we provided one common platform, and media companies and financial services companies and universities and management consulting firms, HR consulting firms, corporations, compensation teams, recruiting firms, sales intelligence firms could all use that data to come up with solutions that extracted intelligence from that platform. In the last 2 years, we've evolved that approach, and we're now making our intelligence much more available across the board. WageScape itself includes an application that allows any user to see what's happening with any job in any market and any time, and then to slice that information based on industry or based on job family, or compare jobs or companies or company sectors right next to each other. And we've really gotten amazing traction with that, because now we've opened up a lot of audiences that haven't had that intelligence available before. So the availability of market intelligence, our mission is to really make the labor market much more transparent and to accelerate the move there. And we're seeing that not just with WageScape, but there's other firms as well that are moving in that direction.
Wow, that's incredible. Really, it's a game changer. Now, where can people find you and WageScape?
So right online, you can find us at www.wagescape.com. spelled
Okay.
just like behind me. And you can find me on LinkedIn. Just look up Cary Sparrow. I think I'm just about the only one on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put those links in the show notes. And Cary, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today on A Seat at the Table. I've learned a tremendous amount about where the labor market might be going, and it's really been an eye opener. So I think a lot of people listening to this also have really learned a lot too.
Well, thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and to talk to your entire audience of listeners.